So I'm Tanya. I'm the planning director here. Uh, this is Matt Ward, who I think some of you met on the way in, and it seems like you already know. Uh, we are in the process now of rolling out our phase 2 of zoning. We're going to walk you through a lot of what that means. The phase 1, we pretty much have at least done a lot of our outreach, and it's at City Council. So the phase 2 is really focusing on the R1. We're hoping to get through kind of just the basics of what R1 is. I have a feeling a lot of you already know. And kind of get to some of the recommendations that we're making. Nothing is set in stone. This is what it's for, this meeting, to throw out those recommendations and kind of get a feel for what everybody's thinking. So our walking tour in Ward F, if you're Ward F or whatever resident, if you want to come to any of the other walking tours, is October 6th. And next week on the 29th, we're doing a citizen planner class, and that will be on Zoom. So, okay. So the other master plan that we adopted, the one before the one we adopted in 2022 or 2021, was in 2000. I wasn't even working here yet. You're supposed to, by law, adopt a master plan every 10 years. We didn't, obviously. There's a reason for that, right? The reason is that visions and ideas sometimes tweak or change, and that should reflect your zoning. The master plan is really the vision and the goals for the zoning, and the actual laws and the zoning have to kind of reflect that. If you've ever been to a zoning or a planning board meeting, you'll hear people refer back to the master plan, and that's because they have to justify reasons that they're maybe asking for variances or asking for a particular project based on what the master plan goals are. So in 2022, actually we started probably a week before the pandemic for the master plan, and then we got sidebarred like a lot of other things through COVID. And so our master plan wound up taking 2 years instead of the one that we wanted. We did a lot of virtual meetings instead, did whatever we could in person near the end we got done. 160 recommendations were made. It was very extensive. If you've been able to look on the website and kind of see the master plan, it's extensive. It deals with the zoning, what we call land use. There's open space recommendations and more of a general visioning plan. This kind of graphic kind of maps out what the process was like. We had all of these general larger meetings. We got a lot of recommendations, and then we took all of those recommendations and we looked at them through specific goals that we wanted to kind of accomplish as a city. One of them was economic development. Hang on, I don't want to misrepresent what they are. I don't want to misrepresent what they are.
We had climate resiliency, social equity, and connectivity and mobility.
Yeah. So we took all the recommendations, kind of categorized them through those lenses, able to come up with goals based on those and specific recommendations. You can hop on. And this is basically, I think, where we wound up simply in a sentence, or where the master plan kind of really gets the heart and soul. Housing policy is transit policy is climate policy. What does that mean? It means that housing can make climate a better or worse place. It can create sprawl. You'll need to rely more on your car. That's one of like the more simple kind of trajectories of what that really means. We'll go through a lot more of that a little bit later. What is the R1 zoning? The R1 zoning on this map is everything that's in white. It's substantial. It's about 30% of all of Jersey City. What does it look like? Kind of pop to the next one. In the Ward F, very specifically, where you guys are, that's so Morris Canal, for example. I know that tends to be where most of the development action is really kind of focused or happening. Is not in the R1. That's in a redevelopment plan. That's separate. So the R1, land around the junction, anything that's in white, you kind of see where it's coming down along the east of Garfield, in between Ocean and Garfield. Hop to the next one. And so what's permitted? In your house, in your apartment building, in your anything. If you're driving down the street and you see building, 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 building. What's the very typical basic requirements in the R1 zoning? That your lot be 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep. It's a 3-story, typically detached building. So our zoning reads that it can be anywhere from 35 feet to 44 feet. And that's because we allow for flexibility in different stories. So some stories can be 12 feet high. Typically, that's a 2-car garage. So that's your cars that are parking one in front of the other, typically not side by side. And mainly that's because there's not really enough room, because at least for the garage, we require it to only be 10 feet. So you're usually parking what we call tandem, one behind the other. 10-foot curb, we do that on purpose to really kind of maximize the most amount of on-street parking. Predominant front yard setbacks. So if you are looking in a part of Jersey City that a building may have come down and been rebuilt within the 80s and 90s, you'll see that the building is set maybe 10 feet back. That is not the predominant front yard setback. That was because at that time, that front yard setback was maybe 10 or 15 feet. We adjusted it in 2000 to be predominant. So it's actually really simple. If you're going down the block and everything on pretty much is at 5 feet, the block, we expect you to build a house that goes at 5 feet to match. Side yards, like what I talked about, which is that if you're on a block where you have attached buildings, you're expected to build an attached building, 0 side yards. It's a little bit difficult. We've come across some issues with building code. Building code is allowing that less and less. Building code wants 3-foot access to the right-of-way in a lot of instances. And the combined front and rear yard requirements is a little hard to explain, but I think mostly the minimum rear yard is 30 feet. And if you have a really big front yard setback, because that's what's required, your rear yard can go as small as 20 feet. So that's what the building footprint is in the R1. That's what we came up in 2000. Was the R1 always the R1? Absolutely not. So the R1, I'd say zoning really comes into place in Jersey City, in most of the country, in the early 1900s. Jersey City adopts its first zoning code in 1931, 1932. And it does it mainly by kind of separating out uses. This is residential 1 and 2, commercial 1 and 2, industrial. And residential A is what I would call a single family, or the closest thing that we have to a single family large lot zoning. And even then you can see it was just 2 units on a 25 by 100 lot. Some very similar things that we see in the R1. The setback from the street line is a little bit different than the way we do it now, but that could have been a 10-foot setback, because most of the time you think about your setback from the sidewalk, not the street, right? 20% lot rear coverage. So just an easier way to do it, right? Some people have lots that are shallower. Some people have lots that are deeper. It's just a little bit of a different way to take a spin on it and still kind of get the same result. 60% building coverage, 2.5 stories, 35 feet. Does it sound familiar? That's probably the closest thing to the R1 that we ever wrote. The residential B, that as a footprint matches today what is our R1. It was the largest zone. It had permitted 2 units, apartment houses, rooming houses, 10 feet, so it was even closer to the street, had a smaller front yard. Parking was never, for the most part, permitted in Jersey City in the front yard in the setback. And the height was tied to the street width. So if your street, most streets are like anywhere from 30 to 50 feet, right? 40 is an average? 45 to 60. So you would have been permitted to build basically maybe 120 feet. Why are there a lot of buildings in Jersey City that are not 120 feet? Technology. That's really the issue, right? Like building materials, the way we were able to build really kind of progresses and makes us able to build higher, taller buildings that are safer. In 1970, Jersey City lost a huge portion of its population, right? And so we talk about this a lot. This is not a new story to anybody. A lot of it was suburbanization, the result of rapid suburbanization in the 50s and the 60s, white flight, and a lot of disinvestment in the cities. So when they were rewriting the zoning in the 70s, they were writing it with that mindset. And they removed, and if you've been a part of any of our phase one conversations, you've already heard this. They removed a lot of our commercial uses from our commercial corridors in our smaller neighborhoods. One of the examples that I use pretty frequently is Old Bergen or Ocean Avenue. In the 70s, it was decided that because there was crime or whatever it was, that those uses, commercial uses, would be not permitted, and they would focus the commercial uses in areas that they thought, I think the commercial uses would be the strongest and maybe last, right? So Newark Avenue, Central, Monticello, MLK or Jackson, however you knew it at the time. Some of the places that were supposed to be, Ocean, down by Old Bergen, or Ferris Triangle, which I know that is not in your ward, were not, right? So it was a little kind of, it's very much a whitewashing. It's really what it is, right? So, but let's focus on the residential part of that. It doesn't really change. You could see the R1. I still call it a low density. I know it's a larger lot, and I know that it doesn't seem like it because it's still a 25 by 100 lot. So forgive me for using that language frequently. But it is our lower density. And the areas for the residential A and the R1 are about the same, right? So we're still looking at residential B and R2. And in that instance, we're still looking at very similar uses, right? We're looking at 40 feet buildings. We're looking at apartment buildings, conditional commercial uses, because again, remember I said these were commercial corridors that they were unzoning commercial and zoning them residential and incentivizing that through saying if you had a commercial unit, you didn't even have to go to a zoning board. You could just go get a permit and turn it over to residential. It allowed for different types of homes, not just the 3-story kind of box. It allowed for townhomes, row homes. It's very obvious when you drive anywhere in Jersey City that there's different types of houses almost in every different neighborhood, depending on, I guess, who was building. And now we have today. And 2000 takes a flip-flop. It gets rid of R1 and residential A, and it takes all the area that was residential B and R2 and makes it all R1. I know that was confusing, right? So it takes the same area that was R2, and it uses the laws from the R1. Basically, downzones most of the city. R2, by the way, still exists, and it continues to exist. And it gets confusing with the R1 and the R2 when we're talking about zoning from the 70s, I know. But R2 exists today as really what we call like our townhouse zoning. Right? It's more like 4 stories, 3 to 4 units. Actually only permits 3, but that type. And so here's 2 maps, and I hope that they're clear for you over here. You can see the 1963 use district map, and that's very similar to the 1932 district map, which you can see, like, the only thing that I really could say is that you could see that there's different patterns of colors, and so there were different uses, different zones. You could see where some of the neighborhoods that maybe you're more familiar around were centered around the dark kind of black lines or the the checkered lines. And then you could see what happened in the 70s. Really, the 86 map, is exactly the rezoning that happened in the 70s. And you can see all the areas that were commercial corridors, how they were just kind of wiped out completely. So what are the weaknesses in the R1? Why do we hold it so sacrosanct sometimes? But there's weaknesses, because if you've gone to a zoning board, you know that there's applications, and most of those applications are in the R1 zone. The illegal third unit. I tell this joke, it's probably not appropriate, but I say the illegal third unit is there, and it's like me telling my mom, no matter how many times you send me to straight camp, I'm still going to be gay. It's just like, I know it's a bad example, but no matter what you do, it's still going to be there. I've been in city planning for 15 years, and that third unit has always been there, always been a problem. I started right before the recession, and people were coming to the zoning board, and they were legitimately asking, these are people, homeowners, it wasn't just developers, who, I need that third unit because they were underwater. Their mortgage was just killing them, taxes or whatever, and they needed that third unit for extra income. In most of those cases, they were not given the third unit. So the box that we built, the 3-story, 35-foot high box, makes you want to put that third unit in it. It just feels right. You're just like, I don't need these 2 cars parking because most of the people don't use the tandem spaces. 1, it's a pain in the butt. 2, it's just not realistic. I think even people who live out in the burbs and have garages, I don't even know if they park in their garages. I think they use them for mostly as storage. So it makes sense that it was an easy way to put a third unit down there. Third units exist. It's just a reality that we have to deal with. And what we wind up doing is giving out violations more than anything else. I know that that chart is hard to see, but the highest number of violations is the illegal third. Ward F is not too bad. It's kind of little on the lower end of the percentage. And then the other thing that nobody wants to talk about, parking in the front yard and curb cuts. It has never been permitted in Jersey City. You have to have a garage, and then you can have a curb cut, and you're supposed to park in your garage. If you have no garage, you are not allowed to park in the front of your house. There was a small period of time under the Cucci administration where Mayor Cucci said if you had 17 feet, they would have somebody from zoning come out with a tape measure and walk it and sign on a paper ledger that you met the standard and you had a legal front yard parking space. It is untenable. There's no way to fight with people that they have legal spaces, not legal spaces. I think Nick Taylor spends most of the time arguing based on Google Earth whether they can prove that they had it from 2007 or 2010, and it becomes a problem that just snowballs. The impact of that is, yes, of course, you have a place to park. You can leave. I have lived in all sorts of situations in Jersey City where I haven't had parking, or I've lived in an apartment building and I've had parking, right now I live in a house with a driveway, which is, I don't know if I've ever had that experience, so I get it. But what it does is it breaks up the sidewalk, and so it makes the pedestrian experience a lot not as safe, right? I have a 6-year-old, and when she's running down the street of all driveways that are legal, I'm constantly screaming, slow down, slow down, slow down. Watch where you're going, watch where you're going, watch where you're going. That's just one of the things. The other thing is that you lose street parking. And in cities, the street are public spaces, public parking, and there's more turnover. So you're going to get more parking spaces on a public access on-street parking than you will for having one person park in their house constantly. So that's a weakness because our zoning encourages that curb cut. It also encourages demolition because the market wants to be able to give you the parking space because that's what people want. And the only way to do that, if you're looking at a house that does not have a garage, is to tear it down, build a 3-story house with a garage. So it incentivizes demolition. This is some of what we talked about, and it just, so in earlier 2000, the R1 was zoned by density. So here's quickly what density means. It just means how many units I can fit on my lot based on number of units per acre. I don't know if there's anything in Jersey City that is an acre. Maybe an industrial something, right? Most of us have 25 by 100 lots or even smaller. So you take the number of people that you can fit in that acre and you just keep dividing it down into your lot. In a Jersey City 2-family on a 25 by 100, we call it 35 units an acre, right? That's really what it means. It means that if you take 35 units an acre and the size of your lot, you would be allowed to have 2 people on there. Because it was generating so many density variances for 2 units, not 3, 2, we went to 1 and 2 family as a use. What that did was it took a density variance where you could have said, well, now I can fit, or you wouldn't even have to go to a board. If you had a larger lot, you could have fit 3 units on there reasonably based on the density standard. And now you would not be able to do that because you would just be required to go for a use variance right off the bat. And so what does that result in? Yeah, it results in bigger units. It results in a use variance application to the zoning board, which is a nightmare for almost everybody. It's a nightmare for the developers. It's a nightmare for the community. It's a nightmare for us. Use variances are not something we take lightly. And in instances where they make sense, because maybe your lot is 35 by 100 and 3 units maybe just fit there more naturally, it's a fight. And it becomes a consistent use variance that we grant, and it wastes your time, my time, when the reality is that the units could fit there pretty naturally. It also creates larger units. And speaking as somebody who has 3 kids and 2 cats, I need at least 3 bedrooms. But affordability is also based on square footage, always, right? And so that doesn't mean that I need to put people in 200 square foot units, but it does mean that maybe a 3-bedroom could be in a 1,200 square foot unit versus a 2,700 square foot unit. It's just very natural that that 27 square foot unit is going to be double the price of a 1,200 square foot unit. So I don't. This is where we grant use variances. Everywhere. Okay, this is a game. It's called Is It Zoned R1? They are all zoned R1. You get 2 points if you know where these are. It's Harmon, right? Oh, wait, no, go back. Sorry. So why would we pick this slide? Not just because I want to see if you know where you live, but because we're looking at, right, old R1 or R2 and new R1, right? We're looking at the housing that was permitted, it was being built, and the housing that we took down and built instead. That's kind of a great example of old and new. Here's an example of new throughout the timeline. I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, Bayonne box. It did not originate in Bayonne. I think it probably was more in Newark than anywhere else. But it really just means parking on the ground floor and 2 stories above with residential, all in one box, one house. And so, sorry. Matt wants me to stop talking. On the right, we probably have the older R1, and you can kind of see how it progresses through time, how over time we tried to fix the R1, right? People were saying we didn't want any more pink brick, so we stopped allowing pink brick. People were saying the balconies are too much, so we recessed the balconies. People were saying the garages were too big, so we made sure the garages were smaller. Over the last 20 years, we've tweaked the R1 as much as we can to get the product that we want. This is actually on Moore Street downtown, which is Ward F. That is probably a rehab on the right, and newer buildings on the left, with the stairway to heaven, we call it. And here's some great examples of, right now, no, they wouldn't be 4 stories. They're 3 stories with basement. Just some older homes. This is on Randolph. Go ahead.
Those same 3 homes, we just wanted to say that from the street you can't tell, but they are shallow lots. There's often a lot of irregular shaped lots throughout Jersey City, including Ward F.
Astor Place, which everybody loves Astor Place. A bunch of what we call town or row homes. This is the R1. It would be a shame if one of them were torn down. Corner commercial. I think this is a park, right? Corner commercial was very common. Again, these were commercial neighborhoods that formed organically through just regular organic migration through Jersey City, and neighborhoods that formed over time and leftovers. And I think this is Bostwick, showing that apartment buildings were and are in our R1 zones, next to, I think that's actually newer housing though, right? Yeah. Another apartment building, another corner commercial in Monticello. In the R1, this is the R1. So not only is it not just 1 and 2 family, it's corner commercial and obviously an apartment building, a 4-story. This is on Fairmont or Storms. This is the R1, which is a auto garage, and I believe this is also across the street, also on Fairmont and Storms, R1 zoning. So that's my half. Matt's going to give you the rest to go through some of the things that we recommend based on some of the things that I just talked about.
Good evening, everyone. Just introduce myself again. I'm Matt Ward. And so we have a couple slides here. We also have some other city workers here. We have Sarah Quinlan, Historic Preservation Officer. We also have Alex McLean from Division of Affordable Housing. So if there are questions later on that are more suited for them, we'll be happy to bring them up. All right. So you're going to see a bunch of slides like this. We have 9 recommendations that we're going to be going over tonight. And we numbered them. The numbers don't really mean anything. It's just so you can keep them in order in your mind. If you have questions, you can pick up a sheet in the back and write it down. You can leave it with us if you don't want to put that out tonight. But so just to organize you, the numbers just for reference, and the quotations are because the thing in the black box is a quote directly from the master plan. Okay, so it's directly how it reads in the master plan. Okay, so the first recommendation for tonight: allow ground floor restaurants as conditional uses at corners and along wide streets to promote the location of more goods and services within walking distance. Next slide. So this recommendation really comes from an overall city context of seeing a lot of corner commercial on your residential side streets. And what we would be thinking for this type of standard is to allow this as a conditional use. And that's a technical term. What that means is a public meeting would be required. And we would be able to levy certain conditions on this type of potential use. So it could be limited to certain types of uses, like restaurants or cafes, etc. We could require them to maximize the amount of glazing or glass, or minimize the signage for these types of uses. And prior to, this would be somewhat of a return to prior standards or older standards. So prior to 2000, corner commercial was a conditional use in the R1. Next slide, please. So why do we want to address this? So in R1 right now, there's an existing weakness that the master plan has identified. R1 is a residential only zone currently, and the zoning therefore puts a burden on the mixed use buildings that now exist in your neighborhood. So finding a tenant, if you're the owner of that building, finding a tenant is difficult. The business, especially if the business is changing. So if it goes from like a restaurant to retail, they just can't simply open up shop. They actually have to secure an attorney, appear before a land use board, and seek approval, which they might not get. In addition to that, if you just go back for a moment. So in addition to that, and this image we liked because it's showing a for rent sign right across the street from that Szechuan restaurant. One of the reasons why a lot of these spaces sit vacant is because they also can't, it's also difficult for them to get insurance on this space. Because if that building was damaged in any way, they would not be able to rebuild it. So that business sometimes can't even get insurance. So it's a very reasonable thing to consider our mixed-use pattern on our residential streets and allow for that to not only exist but to flourish. Next slide, please. So currently in the R1, there is a standard that allows for historic commercial spaces, like this building that was once mixed use, to be converted to single residential, or a single residential unit. And that would be allowed in addition to the two units that are allowed in the R1 currently. So throughout Jersey City, we, instead of allowing for that business to continue, what we were allowing to do, and without any sort of approval, they could just simply go and pull permits and do it. They could convert these commercial spaces into a residential unit. And so that was happening all over. And this is a fabulous example. I think it actually won some historic grants to do this work, and they won some awards. This is up in the Heights. What it does is that it's weakening that kind of mixed-use character, that walkable character in some of our residential areas. Next slide, please. And so we do see this all over. This is on Grand Street in Westervelt. And this is a ground floor space that was converted to residential. And again, just to echo it, this allows that extra unit above, even though this is an apartment building in the R1, they were allowed to do this without any sort of approval, just pulling permits. Next slide. And so we kind of see these two forces right next to each other in this slide. So we have a commercial space that doesn't have a tenant. It has construction paper in the window, right next to a retail space that was converted to residential. So we're seeing these two forces at play. One, not being able to use that space because of maybe an insurance reason, or because they can't find a tenant that meets the existing use that was once there. When I say existing use, like it has to go from retail to retail or restaurant to restaurant. But if that doesn't happen and they can't find someone to occupy that space, then they're gonna have to go to that zoning board and seek that approval, which they might not get. Next slide. So recommendation number 2. Permit the conversion of street-facing garages into small businesses. So, next slide. So yeah, this, judging by the audible response, stick with me for a moment, all right? So, just wait. So this would be set up very similarly, and again, these are options that we're here to talk about. So this would be set up very similarly. Conditional use, it would require a public meeting, that would require notice to anyone within 200 feet. Again, we could require storefront glass. We could look at allowing for front yard, first floor additions. It would remove a driveway and add a street tree, so you could actually gain a curb parking space. And you could also limit signage. Next slide. So this pattern existed, and it was actually a very historic, normal pattern in cities. This is a way of incrementally getting more intense or more diverse in its use in a city. So this is an example right here on Monticello, where these residential buildings had a first floor conversion and an addition from a pure residential building to a mixed use building. Next. And here's another more dramatic example on West Side Avenue, where you could see that this building was set back really far from West Side Avenue at one point, and even dating back to the 1930s, that commercial addition on the front was added. And this is, again, an incremental type of response to a city. Next slide. So there are potential opportunities where next to a light rail station, if that space wants to provide a store, they could. They would have to go through a process that they go before a board and make sure that they meet those conditions, but this is a potential option. And I think it's not only just, it's a little bit bigger. And I think that people have a lot of online businesses, a lot of entrepreneurial business. And if you just navigate on any sort of map browser that you're on, you often see these random businesses located on your residential streets, maybe your neighbors. So like Baby J's Babies or Jam's Sparkling Cleaning Services or Serenity's Natural Organic Growth Oils. So like if this business, say if they meet all the standards and they wanted to have a brick and mortar presence, well, they might be able to not do that on a neighboring commercial street, but they might be able to do that out of a brick and mortar space at their home or the property that they own. And so this was simply opening up that opportunity for something like this to happen. Recommendation 3, provide for attached housing, which can create a more continuous street frontage and eliminate side yards that have minimal usage. Next. So this image right here, it shows some older homes on the right and then some newer homes on the left. And what I just want to point out in this image is that the side yards are about 2 to 3 feet. The garbage cans don't fit down the side, so they actually line them up in the front. And the neighbor with the nice brick wall has actually gone so far to construct what I want to call a spite fence that's only 1 foot wide chain link. And they don't want their neighbor to probably put those garbage cans there, right? So, I mean, it's just not, I mean, I think this example speaks for itself, but these are very underused. And there is an immense amount of examples in the city and in Ward F of housing that's attached. So it's just allowing that to occur. Homes could still be detached. It just would simply be left to the existing environment, right? The existing context. And there's many reasons to do that. Attached housing is more energy efficient. There's simply less surface area to insulate, so it's actually like a climate energy policy, mitigation policy. It would also allow, if there's other standards that control the amount of building space you can have on a lot, well then that building space will now go to the front yards and the rear yards to increase those spaces. Okay? Next. Recommendation 4, increase permeable coverage on individual lots. So, next slide. So that means increasing the landscaping as well as also potentially requiring what we call performative design. So like green roofs, like that capture water on the roof and release it at a slower rate to our actual storm system. So the goal again is to expand citywide green infrastructure and stormwater management. And so we're studying both a reduction in what we call lot coverage or building coverage. So increasing the landscaping, increasing the ability for rain to drop on a property and not sheet flow off or flow back into our streets because it's permeable, not impermeable. But also looking at ways to incentivize or require green roofs to increase that performative nature of even our roofs, okay? And so here's a nice example of a green roof downtown, and then there's an image of what a green roof looks like. It's a tray with like a sedum, like plants that are in it, and they capture that water, and then if they get too inundated, they'll release the water. This is an example of the largest green roof in the city, and it nearly takes up like 90% of that roof. That's on York Street downtown. It's a green roof because it's a plant, but mostly most of what it's doing is that it's capturing that water, and that's the main purpose of a green roof. Next. So now we have a couple of slides that are kind of grouped together. And so we have a couple slides that before we're going to lead back into that recommendation. And I want to set up these next slides with this beginning. So stability, subsidy, and supply is a really good way of thinking about how we actually get affordability and maintain it in Jersey City. And stability is like tenant protections or a senior tax freeze. A subsidy, that's like Section 8 vouchers, rent vouchers, or down payment assistance or grants, right? So, and then the last one is supply. And that has a lot to do with land use or zoning. So stability, subsidy, and supply are these three prongs. And we're going to be talking about supply. And we're going to start with an example here. And so we only have these 4 recommendations left, 5 through 9. And they're all going to be kind of honing back to this slide and how we create affordability. So we have some pictures here. We have 3 pictures dating from 2016 to 2022. And we have what I'm going to call the left property and the right property. So you can see these images. There were older homes that were demolished and replaced with new 2-family homes, right? With garages on the ground floor. One of them even had a garage prior to being demolished. Next slide. So this is an example of how we are not maintaining affordability. This is a story where we're losing affordability because we're not growing our supply. So in 2016, the left property was purchased for $230,000. The right property was purchased for $160,000. There were 2 units in each of these buildings. There was about 2 to 3 parking spaces in these 2 buildings. There's about 1,700 square feet of living area and about 1,400 square feet of living area. The new construction, those sold as condos for a value increase of 500% and 730%. What did we gain in that, right? We gained about 900 square feet of more living space. Maybe you can call that 2 or 3 bedrooms. We gained about 1,500 square feet of living space in the other building, about 4 bedrooms. Gained 0 additional units, and we gained only 2 or 3 more parking spaces. This is a story of how we lose affordability. This is a story of how we do not support people here in this community that want to purchase, right? This is how we do not keep our city affordable. Recommendation 5. Additional residential density to promote restoration of historically significant structures. You'll probably know this example. This was a zoning board application. It is now residential. This was obviously a building that could not be demolished. A beautiful building in a beautiful area of Jersey City. So we're making this recommendation to perhaps allow and encourage buildings that either receive a denial of demolition or can prove that they're historically or architecturally significant, to allow them more density than your 2 units per lot, to encourage that rehab, right? And next slide. So I think everyone would know this building. It's been like this for a very long time. Um, and Tanya, my director, did not write Marione on it. But she actually spells it with an E, so we know it's not her. But so we would, again, we're like working with this same standard. We would allow this as a conditional use. They would have to show that they were denied a demolition. And they would have to appear before a board to show that they're doing that rehabilitation correctly and according to federal standards. So what we're studying are densities that are 55 dwelling units to 75 dwelling units per acre. So 75 dwelling units per acre is actually the density that's allowed in our historic districts downtown, in the townhouse zone of our historic districts, not in the West Bergen, East Lincoln Park district. Those are all a little bit different. But that's what we're looking at right now, allowing for historically significant buildings to be rehabbed by allowing some more apartments. Well, this is allowing us to increase the supply of buildings, and this building right now is only capped at 2 units, right? So, and the question for the recording was, how does that relate back to the previous slides? So this building might not be financially feasible to rehab because of the current limits that we have on it. Allowing for more apartments in this building in a way that would be more, there'd be more certainty that they would actually receive that approval. Still not 100% because they have to appear before a board and actually go through the work of showing that they have to do this renovation. And then they're bound to that. But by allowing the rules to be in place that would allow for them to allow for and encourage them to do it, something like this could potentially be rehabbed and not be a continual eyesore for the 10 plus years it's been like this. Recommendation 6. Prioritize lot width over lot depth as well as lot area. So that's kind of jargony, and we'll get into it in a moment. Going back to that typical building block that Tanya was talking about, the 25 by 100, that's the typical building block in Jersey City. It's the most common lot you'll see in the R1 district. But that's not the only lot that we see. We actually see lots that are very narrow. There's even some as narrow as 12 feet. These are probably 16 to 18 feet. And we see a lot of 20 feet wide lots in Jersey City. Usually they're attached. Usually they're the homes that we walk by and we're like, wow, this is a beautiful area. And they're often beloved or coveted. Next. And they are not just masonry. There's frame examples as well. When I say frame, I mean wood. And they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. 2 stories, 3 stories, some with bays, porches. Next. And some are built, obviously all at the same time. With the same exact pattern, repeating pattern, which is it's actually quite a normal thing to see in a city. And they're right next to lots that are, attached or detached and sometimes are 25 by 100. It exists all over the place. So what the draft standards would be and why this is being considered in this conversation about supply is if you're changing the building block, you're actually allowing for a different type of building to be built on a new lot. So if a lot is a vacant lot and it is 50 by 100, instead of two unit buildings, it could potentially be 3 2-unit buildings. And so some of the draft standards that we're thinking here, or the notes to consider, is that This is recognizing existing patterns of narrow lot development in the city. We're studying a reduction to 18 feet wide lots and a minimum lot area of 1,800, so that's that 18 by 100. We're also studying a provision that would allow subdivisions beyond that. So this was actually a concept taken from our 1963 zoning ordinance. So on lots that are, say, 5,000 or more, they're like a contiguous lot, considering something even smaller than the 1,800. And that's something that we see throughout the city, usually on a corner lot with a shallow rear yard. So let's see here. Recommendation 7, allow detached garages and carriage houses to be converted to accessory dwelling units to increase affordable housing options. Next slide. So this is like another older development pattern, kind of like those residential buildings that got additions to become commercial. This was an older development pattern that we don't see very often anymore. And most of it's because building code makes it difficult or made it very difficult. Also the changes in our zoning laws. This is like here on Summit Avenue. There's Clifton in the back. We see this pattern throughout Jersey City. Homes that are tucked in the backyards of other homes. And so why would this allow for more affordable housing development? These units are smaller typically, and we could put standards on them that make them even smaller than what we're seeing in this picture. But this is something that we would consider allowing. And kind of like that rule where we allowed for old mixed-use buildings to be converted to residential units without a hearing, but just being able to pull permits. We could allow for carriage houses or accessory dwelling units to be allowed in addition to, if you had 2 lots on your lot already, you could build a detached accessory dwelling unit in addition to those two units. Next. Here's just a nice example of one that I like on Monticello Avenue. Front building with the back building, and they're fully detached. Recommendation 8, establish an overall residential density in the R1 district to accommodate 2 or 3 unit dwellings on a 25 by 100 lot. Next slide. And so what does that mean? It's a bit technical of a sentence. And excuse me for this slide's kind of small even for me up here. But what we're recommending, and we're getting into that in a moment, what we're recommending is a standard that still keeps it at 2 units on a 25 by 100 lot. What the number is it's 42 units per acre, but it's still 2 units on a 25 by 100 lot. And what we did to kind of study that number or come up with that number is that we broke up the R1 areas throughout the city into 15 different areas to try to see if there was like some more trends or takeaways that we could get from it. And so when we did that, we actually did find some interesting things. We found that there was a density, say in the General Square area of 49 units per acre. And then in the Bergen, Jackson Hill area, 36 dwelling units per acre. Down in Greenville, or let's say Country Village, it was very low. It was at 27 dwelling units per acre because there are a good amount of single-family homes down there. And so we landed at 42 units per acre, which again still maintains that 2 units on that typical building block, the 25 by 100 lot. Actually, go back. I'm sorry. For some reason, we must have missed the slide. But what that does, and why it's important beyond just a typical lot, the 25 by 100, is if you remember back to that slide that said, it's huge. It was a 35 by 100 lot. And why there's so many use variances in the R1 is because right now, regardless if you're on postage stamp or you got the like Rocky Mountains in your backyard, you can only build 2 units. So on a large lot, it was moving developers or property owners to make applications because they're not going to build 5,000, 3,000, 10,000 square foot units in their 3-story box or more. They're going to come in and seek approval, right? And they're going to seek a building that's maybe 4, 5, 6 stories, right? So allowing for 42 units per acre on a lot, when that's applied to a larger lot, it allows more certainty in the zoning. It rather than an easy argument to say, look, we're not going to build our 6,000 square foot units. We want more units. Okay, that makes sense. Rather than that, you can put a density standard on it, and then that becomes the cap at which they could build a permitted building on a large lot. Next. And the last recommendation, recommendation 9, consider rezoning areas where it may be appropriate to reflect the existing multifamily land use character or the desired development pattern based on the existing context. That's a lot of words. We're actually not doing this right now. We are proposing something else, which I'll bring up in a moment. But what we found was that there's no rezoning necessary in the R1. What we found was that there's many multi-unit buildings that are often distributed throughout the R1 rather than discernible pockets or nodes that we've just inappropriately zoned. So next slide. What we're recommending instead is a recognition of what we see in the R1. When you walk by a multi-unit building, it's hardly ever a 3-story building. It's typically a 4-story building, and sometimes even more. So what we're proposing right now as a draft standard is a 4-story building, but only on large lots that are 7,500 square feet or more. The way you can think of that is if you took 3 buildings and it's one site, that's a 75 by 100 lot. And that truly is recognizing the existing pattern for these apartment buildings on your residential side streets. Next. And we backed it up by doing the research. We studied apartment buildings by lot size in the R1 and found some of the following things we'd like to share. The median apartment building, so the most average apartment building in the city is 3 stories, has 6 units, but it's only on a 33-foot wide lot. So you know this building. We showed it. It's the 6 units, side by side, railroad apartment, without any parking, usually a frame building, sometimes masonry. But that's not what that standard that we just talked about is for. What we're talking about here is more of your larger apartment buildings. So what we did is we went one step further and we looked at these, if there was these numbers changed on lots that are larger. So on lots 5,000 square feet or more, so that's 50 by 100, the average apartment building at that point is 4 stories. It has 17 to 28 units. The density for that is 110 to 135 units per acre, and a lot area between 6,000 and 9,500 square feet. So apartment buildings right now in the R1, and this is not including the areas that will be changing. Some like areas that are on either Kennedy Boulevard or Summit Avenue up in the Heights, or parts of Mallory Avenue that are being rezoned to smaller commercial areas. We didn't look at those lots, but we looked at everything else that still remained in the R1, and 5% of the lots in the R1 are apartment buildings. So they have more than 5 units. And after looking at these numbers and these trends, we saw that this pattern of lots, larger lots at 4 stories that were apartment buildings was a regular pattern. And we're proposing beyond this just base of 5,000 where that trend starts. We're looking at lots that are bigger, like 7,500. So what we're moving into now is we're going to be starting a Q&A. And we have a party favor for you. We're going to hand out something that we like, basically a flyer that we discussed with the recommendations numbered and those draft standards or those notes that were on the slides. In addition to that, so there's the 9 on the front. In addition to that, there's 7 more on the back. So we're going to hand these out now. There's also a QR code where you can go see where this is published. You could share it with other people, a digital version. We're going to be publishing more information there as we move forward. And we'll hand these out, and then we'll start some Q&A.
So if you have a question, you are going to need to take the mic and speak into it, because we are recording, and the only way for it to pick up is for you to use the mic. And I'm sure if you have this question, there's probably 100 other people who have them, so let's let them hear it. Anybody want to start? You just I'll throw the mic at you. This guy. Here's your Councilman Gilmore.